This too shall pass. Wall Street reform, the biggest reform to the financial sector since the 1930s, is going to happen, and it's going to happen soon. For one thing, it's easy politics. Here are some scenes today from D.C. Hundreds of protesters bust in from 20 states, marched in support of financial reform. Protesters packed a Bank of America branch in D.C., causing it to temporarily shut down. The protesters then left that B of A branch and marched to a nearby Citibank office. Protesters also marched outside a top financial lobbying group. Then they gathered at the intersection of 14th Street and K Street. This all happening a day after the same group protested on the lawn of the home of Bank of America's general counsel in Chevy Chase, Maryland. Not to take anything away from the organizing prowess of the protesters, but getting people to want to yell at banks right now is not an uphill battle. I don't put too much stock in polls as news, but just for some perspective here, in the last NBC News poll, after all that Toyota has been through, for example, that company's approval rating was a stinky 31%. BP, in the midst of the huge, terrifying, awful, still out of control Gulf oil disaster, their approval rating is even worse. BP's approval rating, 11%. Goldman Sachs, way worse than that. Goldman Sachs, their approval rating is 4%. BP, in other words, has nearly triple the approval rating of Goldman Sachs. Getting people to yell at banks, to yell at Wall Street right now, is not an uphill climb. And that should not be underestimated as a reason why Wall Street reform is gonna pass. But there's also another political point to consider here. It turns out that the year-long, largely misplayed fight for health reform got Democrats something more than just health reform. Democrats in Congress appear to have learned from the health reform experience what not to do if you want to get something big passed. During health reform, you may recall Senate Democrats pandering and pleading and playing as much ball as possible with Republicans, weakening reform at every step in order to supposedly woo these Republican senators who, frankly, were never going to vote for health reform anyway. That process put the entire focus of the fight for reform on the points of disagreement between Democrats and Republicans. The newsworthiness of health reform each day depended on what parts of health reform Republicans were objecting to that day. It bought Democrats nothing in terms of votes. It elevated the otherwise politically impotent, tiny Republican minority. It watered down the policy. It took forever, and it almost killed health reform altogether. This time, apparently, lesson learned. After initial efforts to work with senators like Richard Shelby and Bob Corker to draft a bipartisan Wall Street reform plan, Democrats said they would not let that process drag on forever, that they would move ahead. They have been voting on amendments to the legislation for the past week or so, and because they're not devoting the process to trying to persuade Republicans who really only want to kill the bill anyway, and because Wall Street reform is a good political issue, the amendment process is actually making the bill tougher. It's making the bill stronger. Think about that for a second. Because Democrats have realized that the country actually wants Wall Street reform, and because Democrats have not fallen into the same trap as they did before about making the reform process all about the wishes of people who don't want reform, as this legislative process goes on longer, the bill is getting better in the sense that it's getting tougher on the Goldman Sachs of the world. Everybody panic! In response to this nasty turn of events, the Republicans' lead senator on Wall Street reform, Bob Corker of Tennessee, told Politico, quote, "I say this facetiously, but for those of us who want a good bill, we should file cloture because every day it gets worse." Another leading Republican on the issue, Judd Gregg, told the same publication, quote, "We should probably finish this bill at some point because it's getting worse every day." So not only is Wall Street reform gonna pass, it's also killed the whole Republican tried and true strategy of delaying something in order to kill it. Republicans might stop filibustering this thing in order to get it over and done with, so Democrats stop adding things to it that they want to run on. We might not only get Wall Street reform really soon, we might kill the Tarantino in the process. Joining us now for the interview tonight is Democratic Senator Ted Kaufman of Delaware. Senator Kaufman, thank you very much for your time tonight, sir.
Hey, Rachel, thanks for having me.
So big picture first, do you think that Wall Street reform passes the Senate and passes the Senate soon?
Oh yeah, I think it'll pass, but you never know because again, we've still got to go through cloture. It all depends on whether the Republicans throw in the towel. If what Senator Corker and Senator Gregg reflects the Republican caucus, and that's what they decide to do. It's kind of in their hands where we go from here. But no, I think eventually it's going to pass.
I know the amendment process hasn't been all one way or all the other. Some tough amendments are failing, some are passing.
Right.
But in general, do you think the bill has gotten tougher on Wall Street since it's been open to amendments?
I think in some areas it has. Of course, the area that I'm primarily concerned with, and that is just the incredible size of our banks and how risky that is for us to have banks that are so large, and also having banks that are involved in such incredibly risky businesses like derivatives, and as we see with this high-frequency trading, I'm still concerned. I'm still waiting to see what happens with the Levin-Merkley amendment, and then what happens with the Cantwell-McCain amendment in terms of deciding where we are on this.
And on that issue, on the issue of banks being too big, it was you and Sherrod Brown, if I'm correct, who sponsored an amendment to quite simply limit the size of banks, to break them up. If they were so big, their behavior could put the country at risk. That amendment did not pass. But when you look at other amendments, other efforts to try to approach that basic issue, do you feel like, A, they have a prayer, and if they don't pass, whatever else passes, are we still fundamentally in danger if we don't have that?
Well, I'm concerned about that. Let's wait and see what happens. But clearly, when you have these massive banks, $2 trillion banks, the sixth largest banks, 63% of the gross domestic product, when you have the top 5 banks in America being involved in 85% of the over-the-counter derivatives, and you look at what happened with the derivatives in the past, and then you look at this new charge, which I think was responsible partially in May 6th, which I've been talking about for quite a while, and that is these high-frequency computer trades in an area where we don't know what's happening. We have no idea, in many cases, we don't know the customer or the time of the trade. I've been calling for tagging the security exchanges looking at it. But, these are very risky things. And we had, for 60 years, we had Glass-Steagall in place, which basically said if you want to be a commercial bank, that's great. But commercial banks should be kind of a low-risk operation, and then investment banks would be over here, and they'd be involved in the risky things. And then we, as you know, we repealed Glass-Steagall in 1999. I think that's a real cause of concern. I mean, for all during the 19th century, we had bank panics. We did up to 1929. We put in Glass-Steagall. We said banks couldn't do that, that commercial banks were going to be places where you could take the money and know it was going to be safe. You didn't have to worry about runs on the bank because you had FDIC insurance to insure the banks. We pretty much settled that. Now, I am concerned that if you have these very, very large banks, and they've gotten larger and larger and larger, if you look at their growth, it's incredible, involved in these very risky things like derivatives and high-frequency trading and whatever new thing they come up with, it's even more risky. I just am really concerned about that.
When you look back on the history of financial regulation, talking about FDIC, the runs on the banks and that no longer being an American concern, when you look back at the history of that, this is one of the things the president has talked about. The banks cried bloody murder when FDIC went into effect. They said that was going to ruin the industry. And, of course, they're crying bloody murder right now while recognizing that public opinion is against them. How intense is the lobbying effort against reform right now?
Well, it's not. I don't get much of it. I think as you know, Rachel, it's pretty clear where I'm coming from. So I really haven't been lobbied that hard. I sat down with folks from the administration on these issues. I sat down with Secretary Geithner and Larry Summers and went through and spent some time talking through what their proposals are. But it's been a very, in terms of me, it's been a very kind of intellectual kind of discussion about what's going on. I've tried to keep it that way, and when I speak on the floor and when I speak and write op-eds and things like that, is to just lay what the facts are on this, what I think is going on, try to stay away from the emotional edge of it. Because really, Rachel, the thing I'm most concerned about is that our financial markets still be the envy of the world. And that really is one of the things that's made this country great, is our financial markets. And I'm just afraid after what happened this last time and then what happened on May 6th, that people around the world are going to say, we really can't depend on American markets. That would be an incredible blow for us coming out of this recession if, in fact, our markets somehow deteriorate in terms of their credibility.
Senator Ted Kaufman, Democrat of Delaware, who's emerged as a very, very clear voice and a big thinker on these issues. Sir, thank you for your time tonight. I really appreciate it.
Great. Rachel, thanks for having me.